Have you ever heard statements like, okay, we might have an all-white Western European panel to discuss a specific issue in the Middle East, but we invited people from the migrant community and nobody showed up or accepted the invitation? Or maybe something like, our media outlet might appear to only publish works by white authors, but that's only because it's hard to find migrants that can write about economics. Of course, implying that migrants can only talk about being a migrant. Or something like, we might not have any migrants present in this neighborhood council, but we invited them and none of them showed up. This needs to stop. So let's talk about it. Welcome to Changing the Table, where we uncover the obstacles faced by new Europeans in politics. I'm your host, Seden Anlar, and on this podcast, we're not only examining how migrants can be empowered to just take a seat at the decision-making table, but we're also deconstructing harmful narratives about migrants to change the table itself. A subtle but devastating narrative that we often hear and witness around us, whether it's related to recruitment processes, event organizing, or policy consultation, is that we do our best to reach out, but migrants with the right skill set or profile are hard to find, or that they simply never participate, engage, or care. These might sound like mundane statements that simply explain away the lack of migrants' representation and presence, but they actually make up a harmful narrative that perpetuates the exclusion of migrants from many spaces where they need and deserve to be. So in this episode, we unpack this narrative and explore how we can tackle it. To help us navigate this topic, I'm joined by two brilliant experts. Salma Rasool, the project manager at Place, a network dedicated to inclusive participation processes, and our returning guest from the very first episode, Olivia Long, managing editor at the Migration Policy Group. Take a listen. Salma, Olivia, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I think I have hundreds of more examples I can give when it comes to this and real life scenarios as well. But Salma, I want to ask you to see if you have any stories or if you encountered this before, because you work on inclusive participation processes and policy making from the bottom up. So if there's anyone that might have heard some of these statements, I'm assuming that would be you. Does any of this resonate with you?
Yes, of course. I think it's really stakes that come back at any level of policy. The one I've worked more with is the municipal level. So kind of what you were talking about municipal council, participation at the local level, and working with municipalities, there was really this question of how to engage newcomers that live within the cities. You know, they exist. For the people from the municipality, a concern that came back all the time was, yes, we know they are here, but they don't want to come, or we tried to reach out, but it didn't work. So for me, it's not so much the lack of interest to include people, but really a question about how to include them.
Absolutely. And Olivia, you have conducted extensive interviews with 20 community leaders and organizers with diverse migration backgrounds. Looking at that sample group, do you think this is one of those things that migrants deal with?
Definitely. And I think, it's exactly what Selma said. It's more about the how. And I think what seems to be missing in a lot of these decision and policy-making processes at the municipal level, at the local level, national EU level, is a lack of consideration of the how. So how to remove, for example, the practical barriers that exist. Because it's not that there's no interest. Really, there's a lot of interest, but it's just there are a lot of these practical barriers like language, the framing, the way the processes work, I guess the practical steps involved in the outreach itself. That's very common. That's something that was mentioned by probably everyone that we interviewed, as well as a sort of a more general lack of understanding of where different communities are coming from, and the fact that there do exist multiple communities within the so-called migrant community which all need different things, need different framing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the how is really important. We can see that how it manifests itself. Salma, do you have any specific examples where that was really prominent? The outreach or the how became a very important issue, and did you see anything that was done that improved the situation practically?
Coming back to the example I was giving you earlier, we were really faced by an issue where zero people with a migration background were in the meetings. And so we really had to reflect on what was wrong, what didn't work in those outreach. And so we had different people from different municipalities that kind of came together to see what didn't work in their context and what did work. So there were various things mentioned, such as outreach in different languages, more visual invitation, as well as more deep conversation on how to make those places inclusive when the actual meeting happens, because it's not only about the invitation, but also is the place safe and empowering for the people that participate. So, for example, with the language, is it formal? Is it informal? So I think what really worked well was to also build from each other's experiences and get to brainstorm on what could be done better in the future.
Mm-hmm. And Olivia, Selma mentioned a couple of these practical solutions. Any other practical solutions that you have in mind, if you can do a bit of a breakdown and mapping out for us?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that was mentioned by people that we interviewed was the need for involvement of new Europeans who've already been through these participatory processes, to sort of lead the way in designing ways to reach other people of similar backgrounds. I think that came through as a really, really important thing to consider. And then, very basic practical things like being aware of the fact that even if you have people's interest, even if people want to be involved, the system is such that they can't be. So there's a lack of remuneration. Meetings are organized at strange times or just really inconvenient times that they can't join, or they're in places that they can't travel to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to make it clear that sometimes it could be that easy to change things and make the process a little bit different and show the effort to the migrant communities as well. It could be as simple as the way that the community does invitations is completely different. I have this problem now that I live in Western Europe. People here invite you to things so much in advance. Like I get wedding invitations 1.5 years, 2 years in advance. How am I supposed to know if I'm going to be free then? Like we might not even be friends by then. It's a really big commitment. But anyway, that's obviously not my main point with this episode. But the practical solutions can be as simple as adjusting those kinds of things. But it goes beyond that, right? This narrative goes beyond that. And I think there are certain aspects of it that we can't just counter with only practical solutions. What I find really unfortunate with this narrative is that it does two things that are harmful. The first thing is it removes responsibility from the ones who have the power to do the outreach, because it's based on the assumption that the ones that are supposed to do the outreach have done their fair share. They are the professional ones. They've done their best for great participation. So the second thing the narrative does is to then put the blame on the migrants themselves through these harmful stereotypes. It's the migrants' fault because despite those efforts made, they don't care enough to engage. Olivia, looking at the research you conducted, what kind of stereotypes or assumptions does this narrative imply?
Yeah, in addition to that one, which is one of the biggest, I think alongside it is this idea that people who didn't grow up in Europe couldn't possibly understand European democracy or how we approach democracy in Europe. And I think that's really, really damaging, because then you're basically ruling out any possibility of their involvement in the future just because you're assuming that they couldn't possibly get it, ignoring the fact that the democracy we practice in Europe isn't necessarily an ideal form of democracy anyway. One of the things, not everyone, but a few people mentioned was these deeply held colonial beliefs and the assumptions that they lead to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that feeds into things like the narrative that you couldn't possibly understand European politics because you didn't grow up in Europe, or that you wouldn't be interested in it because it's not what you're familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the idea that people are not interested means that policymakers don't try very hard to involve them, or think that it would make them hard to reach, or that if they do reach them, they would have questionable opinions to share. And so it's not worth trying.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in reality, it's much more simple than that. And it's just that the processes don't exist, or they're not designed in the way that they need to be. And there are practical things in place that prevent them from joining.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I guess there's the ideological assumptions in addition to the actual practical barriers.
Mm-hmm.
Just to add on a bit on what Olivia said, people are interested in democracy and how it works, even if they don't have much prior knowledge. With the people I work with, it was always a matter, we want to learn more, we want to know how it works. So this is assumption that people are not interested, I think, is very negatively impacting the way we do things for now.
Mm-hmm. How can we counter these stereotypes? I mean, not to pose a very big question to you.
Thank you for the big question. I think there's many solutions, but we really need to shift away from this humanitarian approach of seeing people with migration of not just receiver of help, but also co-creators. Because I think, Olivia, you mentioned it before, but we need to include people with migration background in the solutions that are created to include them, because they know better what are the barriers, what are the challenges, and how we can create safe spaces for them. So I think there's no answer to these questions that are straightforward. It's more a co-creation process that needs to happen with the policymakers and people with migration background. It cannot only come from one side, because then it only represents one side. So I think we really need to rethink the way we engage people with migration background. That can come also with training of policymakers that can be trained to engage with people with migration background, how to deal with the intercultural aspect, the trauma as well. So I think there's an array of things we can do, but we should do it together.
Absolutely. What did you apply? What kind of solutions did you apply in the story that you mentioned earlier to address the issue?
So we did a bit of both, actually. First, we did trainings, both for the people from the municipalities to be able to engage in a safe and meaningful way with the people with a migration background, as well as the people with a migration background to be able to represent their communities and understand how the municipalities worked. And once that was done, they kind of met organically and tried to find solutions to make the municipality more accessible for newcomers, whether they're people with migration background and beyond as well, because a city more accessible for people with a migration background is arguably one that is more accessible to all. So they kind of work together on solutions such as creating a little training for people with migration background to be engaged with the municipality, creating, like we said before, different language outreach. So they really came up with an array of solutions that could work for their specific context.
Mm-hmm. And maybe let's go beyond the practical solutions that we've been talking about, because both of you mentioned some other dynamics that might be pushing migrants to disengage in the first place. And I think, as well as changing certain things that we do on a practical level, we need to address those to have a more systemic change. I think we mentioned something like when the training for the migrants or a process for the migrants is led by people from the community themselves, that makes a big difference. When migrants see that there is genuine follow-up after that process or activity, the next time there might be greater engagement and participation. So maybe let's tackle these kinds of dynamics as well. Olivia, if you think any other dynamics that are contributing to this.
I think those are definitely the most commonly mentioned among the people that we spoke to. Definitely this idea that people who are doing the decision making need training themselves. And if we really want to do it properly and effectively and sustainably, it needs to be delivered by new Europeans, people with a migrant background, because they are the ones that know, as well as the training for decision makers, policymakers by new Europeans, also training perhaps by new Europeans, perhaps by other people on dismantling these biased and racialized narratives, because I think there's a lot of different levels that go into that kind of training. And perhaps that's one thing that would really help us to unlearn a lot of the internalized racism that we have, or the internalized biases that we have. I think it also needs to be approached with, as you said, Selma, this idea of like really, really, truly equal participation, equal accountability, follow up on both sides. I mean, to refer to the practical again, because I do think they have to go side by side. That requires a lot of funding. It needs things like increased financing of participation, of migrant-led organizations, initiatives, campaigns, covering things like core costs. And I think as those barriers are overcome, that frees up capacity for advocacy and delivery of training to policymakers. And in that way, then things will change at the narrative level. I think we're doing quite a good job already of talking about changing the narrative, but I think actually changing it requires a lot more dedicated resources than we currently have. Also mentioned by a few of the people we interviewed was the problem that the way the existing narratives make people with a migrant background feel about their own capabilities, their own capacities for involvement. A lot of people we spoke to said they didn't even believe that they could ever join in, they could ever contribute to a decision-making process, because it had never been implied that they would be able to, even if they wanted to, because they just didn't have the right kind of understanding. They weren't coming from the right kind of background. This idea of self-confidence, which, as we know, is affected by previous experiences anyway. I think that's something that holds participation back. And it can mean that people are, in fact, hard to reach because they don't even realize that they're worthy of being reached, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. Selma, you're nodding.
And I think more than that, it's also compounded with other identities that we might have as women, young people. We disqualify ourselves from trying to access those places that we're entitled to actually be in. And just to come back, Olivia, on what you were saying, a lot of the work we do actually is empowerment and feeling that you are worthy to occupy those spaces. And this actually comes through role modeling. So if the migrant community is leading the workshop, the cooperation, it's role modeling first for the migrant community because they see they can be in those spaces of power, and also for the policy making and actors because they see that the migrant community is not passive. They're also leading the conversation. So I think this whole narrative issue that we're trying to grapple with, we need to role model more. We need to lead the way in changing the narrative. And I think it can also only be done with actually doing it, concrete action. You see people in power. It can't just only be theory.
Yeah, absolutely. And also that changes the power dynamic we're talking about, right? You both made a great point actually throughout this whole conversation, which is equal participation. One thing that this narrative clearly outlines is that there are two parties here. On the one side, the ones that hold the power to include certain groups of people in processes and activities, and the other group, which is literally the other, and the one that needs to be invited in and included. So a really strong insider-outsider dynamic, a power imbalance that's inherently embedded in this outreach and hard-to-reach struggle, which obviously doesn't really lead to equal partnership kind of a dynamic. If you see another migrant that's already there in that space, taking the space and creating space for you, that creates a sense of safety, the safety that we mentioned and belonging. And that's important, I think, because while I was working on this episode, I was constantly thinking like, this sounds like the worst gig ever. Why would we do this to ourselves? Like, we're living in this dynamic, this power imbalance the whole time. That's 24/7. So why would you go out of your way to put yourself in another situation where you're in the same dynamic again? Why would you do that? It might not be safe for you mental health wise. You might be asked to only talk about issues relating to being a migrant. After realizing that there's a pattern there and the power imbalance, it's very hard to put yourself out there again and again and again and be okay with being there as the token one to check boxes and all those things. And that's why the representation, even though it's now seen as a bit of a buzzword, it actually makes real life difference.
I think there's something really important in what you just said about it's not just mental fear, but as well as fear of repercussion sometimes, because we're still talking about people that have unstable situations sometimes. And so by participating, they're putting themselves in a very precarious situation sometimes because they fear repercussions. And so I think anyone who chooses to participate is incredibly brave in many ways. And so I think we really need to go beyond that. Also, it only needs to be about their migration journey, that it can be incredibly traumatizing for them, but they can also participate in a lot of issues and bring many great conversation forward. Migration is not just only about migration, it's about the environment, about social issue, about what the city looks like in the future, about how the city is constructed. So there's an incredible array of topics one can contribute with. And I think, like you said, Seden, it also needs to go beyond tokenism. So not just invite one time the same person always, but represent more people on a vast array of topics. And also a very, very important point is that they're within the decision-making spaces, not separate spaces in which they kind of do their recommendation and then maybe we'll consider it, maybe not. It needs to be in the spaces of power. And I think a lot of big institutions are going towards that. At the GIF, the Global Refugee Forum, there were more and more spots for refugee. But I think there's still this big question of how can we make it really inclusive and representative.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to what you said, Seden, about this idea of safety and belonging, or the necessity of feelings of safety and belonging. And then, Salma, you picked up on tokenism. And I was just going to highlight that I think, according to the people that we spoke to, there's a complete lack of follow-up of the involvement that does happen, which then serves to disincentivize people from joining in the future. They feel left out, they feel disillusioned, there's no follow-up accountability, and it leads to people perhaps joining. They're perhaps easy to reach in the first instance. They join for a couple of meetings, then they never hear back from the people that they spoke to. They never see their recommendations being considered down the line. Pretty much every single person we spoke to said they felt that their involvement or the involvement of people they knew had been purely tokenistic. And that leads to a real lack of trust in policymakers, policymaking processes, and a real lack of safety and feelings of safety and belonging. And so I think that we really, really need to ensure equal involvement at every level and ensure this follow-up and accountability is built in to these processes. And I think we can only ensure that by designing those processes with new Europeans. A lot of people mentioned the need for evaluation strategies and to know that they were involved, not just at the beginning or not in a separate meeting, like Salma said, but in the initial stage, in the follow-up stage to that stage, in the interim stage, in the final stage, and then in the evaluation stage after the final stage. And that really doesn't happen. And actually, that's quite a simple thing to fix. Once you get your head around the idea that people should be included at all levels, it's really, really possible. I guess we can see it happening with other minority groups, and we can see in some places, some municipalities or localities trying to take an intersectional approach. It just needs to be a little bit more expanded.
Olivia, I feel like all the episodes we've done together, this is the second one, we get to this part of the episode and we both go, it's easy, isn't it? It's just common sense.
Just common sense, yeah.
Exactly.
And if I may add, once you do that easy step and you create equal processes, and really, Olivia, thanks for highlighting that includes from the beginning to end, the response I got from the people with migration background was, wow, they actually care about us and we can build things together. So there's kind of this relief of we're considered as people and not just objects for once in our interactions. And it kind of contributes to this whole narrative change that we're talking about that is super central, I think.
Absolutely. That just goes to show the work that needs to be done for the migrants to show up. It shouldn't just happen at the invitation phase or even the way that the invitation works, but it's about what you do for migrants and with migrants when you don't need them in a room. As long as we get that framing applied in these processes and just have them as equal partners along the process, that should address most of these issues that we mentioned. And I guess the alternative to inviting migrants just to check boxes is to see the value of ideas that come from a room that is diverse, a room full of people from different backgrounds and different walks of life, because the ideas that come out of those kinds of rooms will make a difference. And that's what we're after. And that's why on this podcast, we're not chasing a narrative that says, just go for it and, a few individual success stories to take a seat at the table, but we're actually trying to deconstruct and change these harmful narratives and dynamics so that we can change the table itself.
Maybe just on your last point, when you say different walks of life, I think it's really, 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 really important, because usually these processes, they tend to engage really high profile that did certain kind of studies. So you do not engage all the migrants when you do that. So we really need to think also beyond only engaging the people that resemble us and the way we operate, but also other voices that might be marginalized and be comfortable with other type of processes. So really thinking outside the box and with the people in mind.
Absolutely, absolutely. Olivia, throughout this entire conversation, we have unpacked this narrative, touched upon several aspects of how it manifests in day-to-day life, and also covered what we can do about it. If you could offer a simple message for everyone to take from this episode, what would it be?
One of the biggest takeaways from the interviews was that people felt that it wasn't just about teaching migrants to fit into the decision-making processes that exist, but it is truly about changing the process itself, and that includes both by removing the practical barriers within it and also by dismantling the biases and the exclusionary assumptions that underpin it. And only through that will we be able to start properly ensuring meaningful participation.
On that note, thank you so much for this conversation. Hope to have more of these talks with you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
As we wrap up this episode, it's clear that the narratives surrounding migrant participation in decision-making processes are deeply entrenched and often exclusionary. But hopefully in this episode, we were able to establish that there are so many ways through which we can challenge and tackle these narratives and stereotypes. From practical solutions like training and diverse outreach methods, to addressing deeper systemic issues such as tokenism and internalized biases, there is a clear path forward. It's not just about inviting migrants to the table to check boxes, but fundamentally reshaping the table itself to ensure equal participation and representation. As Selma and Olivia have highlighted, the key lies in co-creating solutions with migrants, dismantling biased narratives, and creating environments where everyone feels safe and genuinely valued. By embracing diversity and actively challenging existing power dynamics, we can truly transform our decision-making processes for the better. For more on this, please check out Olivia's research, Meaningful Participation of New Europeans in Policymaking. You can find the link in the description. This podcast is produced by the New Europeans Initiative, a project of the Migration Policy Group, an independent Brussels-based think and do tank that sets the agenda on integration, migration, and anti-discrimination. Funding for the podcast is provided by the Citizens, Equality, Rights and Values Program of the European Union. If you like this episode, please subscribe and spread the word. Changing the Table is available on all podcast platforms. If you want to stay updated, follow the Migration Policy Group on social media at MigPolGroup and subscribe to the newsletter at www.migpolgroup.com. Thank you. See you very soon.